About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
So go through the countries again?
Well, starting with Iraq, then Syria and Lebanon, then Libya, then Somalia and Sudan, and then back to Iran.
Spread out that way.
What happened here?
Yeah.
Nothing much. I was shot at over here when we landed and we came ashore.
What happened here today was Echo Company Plus came in, secured the airfield so that they can fly supplies, and we can secure the airfield for the birds that are coming in with all the supplies for the Somalian people. All right, let's go.
All right, now keep your eyeballs open. Let's go.
Let's go. Start paying attention now, gents. Get spread out. Get spread out. Let's go. Bull Rush 19. Bull Rush 19.
Step up. Please. Got anything?
What happened here today? We basically moved in and set up a defensive perimeter. That's basically what happened, and another group went off to do another mission elsewhere. We just gained a foothold here because it's a relatively area with relatively low hostility. So we moved on in this area here just so that we can operate from here, basically.
They don't show hostile intent, leave them alone. They show hostile intent, they charge their weapons and put their weapons on and destroy them. If they leave us alone and they stay and they don't put their weapons on us, they get to live for another day.
Safe. Yeah. Same rules stand. Vehicle come flying at us. Choose to stop.
I got a vehicle coming here. It ain't ours though, but it's coming. Better stop them. I got it.
It really didn't hit me until we got on ground. I saw all these people out here. And then being around, I've been to a lot of other countries and a lot of cultures, but I never seen what I saw today, being I was on the road over here. And having all these people coming up to us telling us to go back home really faced, my American pride about telling us to go back home, and they don't want us here. But then there was the other ones that were coming up asking our names, saying they were glad that we were here.
Welcome back to NTDH Brief. In world news, gunmen loyal to Hezbollah are fighting pro-government supporters in Lebanon. Fierce clashes are reported in the capital, Beirut, and other violence was also seen in other parts of the country. Let's take a look.
The sound residents here in Beirut dread most. Gunmen loyal to Hezbollah opened fire on buildings as they battled pro-government supporters in the Lebanese capital. Lebanon started to slide towards conflict after the US-backed Beirut government declared a telecommunication network run by Hezbollah was illegal. Iranian-backed Hezbollah said this meant the government had declared war by targeting their network. They vowed to cut off the hand that tried to dismantle it.
Whoever declares war on us, even if a father or a brother, let alone a political adversary, we reserve the right to confront and defend our arms and existence. The telecom network is not part of the resistance's arms. It is the most important part of the resistance.
Supporters of Hezbollah and its allies have blocked roads leading to the airport, Lebanon's only air link to the outside world, and other main streets, paralysing much of the city. Hezbollah say the only way out of the crisis is for the government to attend talks, aiming to end a 17-month-long political conflict with the Hezbollah-led opposition. The street confrontations this week have aggravated the country's worst internal crisis since the 1975 to 1990 civil war and exacerbated sectarian tension between Sunnis loyal to the government and Shiites who support the opposition.
Here are the facts. After leading Libya for over 40 years, Muammar Gaddafi was assassinated in October of 2011. What ostensibly began as a civil war became an international conflict. Western powers armed rebels and conducted airstrikes. Many U.S. voters weren't sure why NATO intervened in Libya. In an April 2011 statement, NATO described the intervention as a humanitarian act, protecting Libyans by removing Gaddafi. This reasoning remains controversial. After all, there's no shortage of brutal dictators. What made Libya different? Who exactly were its rebels? Here's where it gets crazy. Why topple the Libyan regime and allow despots across the world to survive? It's a good question. In the absence of hard evidence, theories proliferate. As in the Iraq invasions, many theories center on oil. Libya has the largest proven oil reserves in Africa. For years, Gaddafi pushed for the nationalization of regional oil resources. Could this be cause for war? It's true that nationalization and independence bit into private profits after World War II. Countries that actually own oil began to circumvent Western multinationals and sell their resources directly. As Brian Levy cites, in 1949, 7 major oil companies owned 88% of traded oil. By 1953, they owned 73%, not counting oil in the United States or communist countries. In the 50s, the companies had revenue of about 80 cents per barrel. By 1970, it fell to 38 cents. This isn't the only theory. Gaddafi also wanted a financially united Africa with its own regional currency, an Africa dinar tied to the gold standard and a central bank. Would moving away from petrodollars and reducing the influence of the IMF and World Bank be enough to write Gaddafi's death warrant? Gaddafi's government wasn't the first to push for these sorts of rules. Saddam Hussein wanted to sell oil in euros, and Iran has made similar signals. Correlation isn't causation, but oil and banking were factors in the conflict. Rebel forces established a new central bank and a new oil company just weeks after overtaking the country. So who are these rebels? The answer's complicated. Some have been tied to terrorist groups, and then there's Khalifa Hifter, one of the top men in Libya's new government. He was a colonel in Gaddafi's army until he defected, and before returning to Libya in 2011, he lived for 20 years outside Langley, Virginia, with no visible means of support, leading journalists to deem him a CIA asset. This isn't to say that Gaddafi was a saint, but it is important to note that NATO's narrative leaves questions unanswered. Was the Libyan conflict really an altruistic act of humanitarianism, or was there another motivation? Something that NATO doesn't want you to know.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign. More than 35 countries are giving crucial support, from the use of naval and air bases to help with intelligence and logistics to the deployment of combat units. Every nation in this coalition has chosen to bear the duty and share the honor of serving in our common defense. To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you. That trust is well placed. The enemies you confront will come to know your skill and bravery. The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military. In this conflict, America faces an enemy who has no regard for conventions of war or rules of morality. Saddam Hussein has placed Iraqi troops and equipment in civilian areas, attempting to use innocent men, women, and children as shields for his own military, a final atrocity against his people. I want Americans and all the world to know that coalition forces will make every effort to spare innocent civilians from harm.
As the threat of a civil war looms over the world's newest country, the U.S. is moving additional Marines and aircraft to South Sudan, raising the number of U.S. troops in the region to 150. A week ago, clashes between rival groups in the capital of Juba began and then spread across the East African country. 46 U.S. troops were deployed Saturday to help evacuate Americans from the violent region, and 4 U.S. troops were injured in the evacuation mission as gunfire hit 3 military planes. All 4 troops are in stable condition, but President Obama has said that he is monitoring the situation. In a letter to congressional leaders on Sunday, Obama wrote, "I may take further action to support the security of U.S. citizens, personnel, and property, including our embassy in South Sudan." It's clear that some of that action has been taken already as the U.S. moves its troops from Spain to the Horn of Africa in order to provide more embassy security and help with additional evacuations. The extra forces will move into Djibouti, where the U.S. has its only permanent military base in Africa. The military buildup also includes Osprey helicopters and C-130 transport planes. South Sudan won its independence from Sudan in 2011 after decades of war. The country has some of the biggest oil reserves in sub-Saharan Africa after Nigeria and Angola.
We turn next to the battle against ISIS, which now controls as much as 40% of the Syrian town of Kobani on the border with Turkey. Fears are rising tonight of a possible massacre. So are tensions between the U.S. and Turkey about how to best confront the threat. Holly Williams is in Istanbul.
Kobani has become an urban battleground. Nearly all its residents have fled as ISIS militants advance street by street in the strategically key border town. Hundreds have been killed, many of them Kurdish fighters defending Kobani from the Islamic extremists. "We're proud of our martyrs," said this woman as she buried her son. They faced these terrorists as no one else could. The militant surge continues despite intense US-led airstrikes around Kobani, showing just how limited the strikes may be in defeating ISIS. Turkish tanks and troops are massed at the border, but have so far stood by and watched. US officials said today that Turkey's agreed to help train Syria's moderate rebels, but hasn't committed to doing so on Turkish soil. The US also wants Turkey to allow its bases to be used to launch airstrikes against ISIS. But in return, Turkey wants the US to help weaken the Syrian regime by setting up a secure no-fly zone in northern Syria. That would also stem the tide of more than 1 million refugees that's flooded into Turkey during the Syrian civil war.
As Kobani is attacked by ISIS militants, the US and Turkey are negotiating about how to combat the Islamic extremists. Turkey says a no-fly zone is key. But Jim, as America resists deeper involvement in Syria, that's not something the US is willing to agree to.
Holly Williams in Turkey for us tonight. Thank you, Holly.
The White House says the U.S. will begin easing economic sanctions on Iran after Tehran began shutting down its most sensitive nuclear work Monday. Iran's move was part of a landmark deal struck with world powers to ease concerns over its nuclear program and provide for the partial removal of sanctions that have crippled the country's economy. The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed that higher-level uranium enrichment at a facility in central Iran has been stopped.
The Islamic Republic of Iran has taken the measures according to the commitments made in the Geneva Agreement.
Iran has agreed to halt its 20% enrichment program, which is just steps away from bomb-making materials, and continue enrichment up to 5%. It has also agreed to convert part of its stockpile of 20% enriched uranium to oxide, which can be used to produce nuclear fuel but is difficult to reconvert for weapons use. Back in Tehran, some residents expressed satisfaction with their country's decision.
I believe there will be a positive impact on our lives and the economy. I'm optimistic about the process, and I hope to see the positive effects of it in the coming years.
The European Union has also said it will lift some of its economic sanctions against Iran. White House spokesman Jay Carney said Washington will still enforce the sanctions that remain in effect. Kelly Daschle, Associated Press.